sorry, does or suffers something or becomes something from a doctor, when as a doctor he suffers or does or becomes these things, it is clear that also this comes into being from what is not, means what is not insofar as it is not. They left out this very thing, not having distinguished it, and on account of this mistake, they made so great an additional mistake as to believe that nothing comes into being or is anything else, but rather to abolish all becoming. Does anyone have a strong sense of what the mistake is? I know he's talking about probably Melissus and Parmenides from earlier, but what exactly is the mistake he's saying? Because it's the word, he uses the word "it" too much here. James Cook?
Well, he is pointing to the mistake of doing away with becoming, but so the idea that there is a thing may not come into being from what is not, or in a qualified sense. So, but this is a thing coming to be from a privation. So I guess the example is doctor from not doctor. Yeah, it is a little bit, the text is a little bit confusing.
Yeah. Thanks for trying to parse
but
it.
That would be a bad mistake to say that nothing comes from, it's impossible that it should come in any way from what is not, like doctors come from not doctors, et cetera, and so forth. So I think that's his point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, James Cook. Go for it, Dave.
Is the mistake seeing everything as an undifferentiated unity? And so if everything is just this one big blob, then there is no motion. I'm just wondering out loud, because I keep going back to that first line of chapter 6, where he says it's not one thing because the contraries are more than one, and it can't be infinite because then we just wouldn't know anything about it. So it's got to be something in between. And it seemed like what some of these earlier thinkers had done was try to make everything one thing.
Thank you, Dave. Peter?
So there's two things. One is he's getting at the distinction between essential and inessential things with, the doctor building the house. He doesn't build it as a doctor, he builds it as a house builder, right? So it's not that there's this absolute notness about it, but it's not, the person building the house is doing it as a builder, not as a doctor. If he heals himself, he's doing it as a doctor. If he's a patient, he's not getting healed because he's a doctor, but because some other doctor worked on him. So that's that part. But right at 191b10, he says, this comes into being from what is not. If you just take that one sentence, part of the sentence, you could try and understand it the way Parmenides did. There's either being or there's this unspeakable thing, the not being. We can't even talk about it. Nothing can come from it. You can't even think about it, blah, blah, blah. But he says that that's not really what it means. What it means is what is not insofar as it is not. And they left out that insofar as, and that was the mistake that Parmenides makes. He's trying to say that anytime you use negation, it was complete absolute negation or something like that. Whereas you can have a lack of something, like that's where they're going to the swarthy, right? From white to swarthy. It's the lack of the swarthy. It doesn't mean that it came from pure nothingness or out of nothingness. But he's raising the possibility of lack or deprivation as a thing to consider. And that's something that Parmenides had overlooked. I think that's roughly what he's talking about.
I got questions about that, but let's go to Charles.
David P. I think I got it pretty much exactly what I want to say, and I'll make it short. I have a different translation, but right at the end of the paragraph, before the one on the doctor, and I think yours might be similar, he says, so they deny even the existence of a plurality of things, maintaining that only being itself is. Such then was their opinion, and such the reason for its adoption. And that's the mistake that they were making. Just simply saying that there was no plurality of being at all. And Aristotle then is establishing here why there is a plurality of being.
Thank you, Charles. I wanted to go to Peter. Do you think that, because we're talking about things coming into being, does something white, like, I feel like the oppositional thing and the argument for deprivation, is that what he's talking about with articulation? Because are opposites inherent in a thing, or is it opposites that we see because we have language? Like that's, yeah. And Peter, you can start us off, and we can go to David. Since it's directed at you, but yeah, because it would seem that the swarthy and the white thing, like, something can go from being hot to being cool, I guess, like if the sun is beaming on a rock all day, and then at nighttime that rock goes from being hot to cool. I don't know, but yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Peter?
I'll just say, I think that the articulation in that sentence, he was talking about the articulation of the form. I think that's what the previous reference was. But as far as, I don't think that he's like going to say that there is like contradictions in everything in itself, right? But he's very concerned also throughout all of his works here with building up what does it take in order for us to be able to study something, have a science of being. This is just going to be a science of natural things. And every science is going to have start from some place and then have some sort of contrary that it uses to make the species out of from a given genus. So from animals, you'd have the footedness, 1-footed, 2-footed, 3-footed, 5-footed, whatever. Maybe not very many pogo sticks in nature, but anyway. So the white to swarthy, the color is the dimension across which some underlying thing can change. And Parmenides would just, I think, say that there can only be the being of white Socrates, and then that would have to blink out somehow, and then the being of the tan or swarthy Socrates beaming in, and that there's no conceptual thing because he doesn't allow for the being of the underlying subject to persist across that change, and the lack is only in the inessential attribute of color. But I don't know. Anyway.
David?
Yeah, like what everyone has said so far, I'm not much of an Aristotelian, but for a long time, haven't read this before for a long time. I get the feeling, though, that we're struggling a lot with the Greek language and the limited conception of being. And that we're talking about really different kinds of coming into being, as though it's all the same question. And I think the Aristotelian text is bogged down in this, and we don't feel this at all today. When we say the car, was built, it didn't exist before. How they come into being, we kind of understand how form is essential. It's a cause. The thing doesn't exist until it has form. We understand these causes, and we don't talk about them as the four causes. And we're so fluid and comfortable with this that it's sort of almost, we're painfully seeing how without those distinctions built in conceptually, the sophistry can occur, right? So because we have a material view of the world and making things, and form comes and goes so readily by our keeping the underlying substance of atoms and rearranging them and having things come into being and cease being, this is so easy for us. But it may not work as well when we talk about spiritual characteristics or human beings and their characters, what their being is. But so that's all. Everyone else has explained so adequately what is being said here. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Okay, let's go to the very next page on 45 and chapter 9. This is in the middle, towards the end of that paragraph. For the nature that persists is a co-cause with the form of the things that come into being, like a mother, while the other portion of the opposition might often be slandered as not being at all by one who fixes his thinking sternly upon it as upon a criminal. But since there is something divine and good and sovereign, we say that there is something opposite to it and something else which inherently yearns for and stretches out toward it by its own nature. For them, it follows that the contrary yearns for its own destruction. However, it is not possible either for the form to long for itself, since it is not defective, or for its contrary to long for it, but it is the material that does this, as does the female for the male, or the ugly for the beautiful, except that in its own right it is neither ugly nor female, except incidentally. That last word, I had a lot of trouble kind of wrapping my head around. But yeah, I guess first part, kind of wondering about this, that the thing that persists is also a co-cause of the form of the things. So I'm wondering if anyone has a good example for something like that. So maybe, yeah, if someone has a good example for something like that, and then there was something else in the last part, but let's go to Dave first and see.
I don't know if I have a great example, but the sentence just prior to where you started, I feel is important. And it says, for they advanced as far as this, I'm in chapter 9:10. For they advanced as far as this, there must be some underlying nature, but they make this one, and he does not like this. For even if someone makes it a dyad, calling it great and small, nonetheless he makes them the same. And so I feel what he's talking about here is when we only look at one side of this equation, these others that have come before, only we're looking at one side, and in making everything one, they made everything the same. And so we need to, or Aristotle wants us to consider the other portion of the opposition. That's what they are treating as a criminal, but this is essential for him. Maybe some other people can fill in the blanks. But that sentence before is this recurring theme here. He's trying to steer us away from this idea of everything being one.
Thank you, Dave. David?
Yeah, in a certain way, I mean, I see a compatibility between seeing everything as one and seeing all the changing and differences. Again, I'm going to resort to physics as an example. So you have, the components of a molecule that each have their own property, but when they combine, and there's sunlight, and it's part of your skin, there's melatonin mixed in. Now, all of a sudden, that skin participates in a different spectrum. And you say, now it is swarthy. Swarthy has come into being, or brownness has come into being. There was no brownness before, but we're participating in brownness. Brownness, conceptually, the form brown exists, but not realized in a material thing. So the atoms are fixed. They have not ceased to exist. They are still themselves in their identity, but because of the particularization of their now being in a form clumped together a certain way, something new exists and it participates in things that as forms existed, but it didn't have before. So the material is essential to the form being realized as having being. That's an example of what you asked about.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Peter?
So I want to go also back to where Dave started, that sense for they advance as far as this, that there must be some underlying nature. So they get that right. In order to be able to account for change, you have to have some underlying thing, some underlying nature that sort of persists across the change. And they get that part right. But they make this thing one, this underlying persistence one. What I'm saying, what I think he's saying is that if something is one, it can't change. There's nothing, I mean, it's just a unit, it just, what he's going to say is that no, a being, a thing, an underlying subject can have multiple other attributes. And it's one of these inessential attributes that we're going to be changing, like from white to swarthy or tan or whatever you want to call it, right? So continuing on from there, for even if someone makes it, i.e. this underlying thing, a dyad, great and small, he makes them the same. Or he overlooks the other nature. So there's this other nature, there's the nature of the underlying thing, the nature of this thing that is changing. So then Socrates has his own nature, but the nature that's changing is from white to tan or light to swarthy or whatever you want to call it, right? For the nature that persists is a co-cause with, so nature persists, Socrates, is a co-cause with the form of things that come into being. What is coming into being is the swarthy. So that is a form that's going to come into being. And then he gets to the thing, like a mother, well, the other portion of the opposition might be slandered as not being. That would be the lack of the swarthy. When he starts off as pale, he lacks the swarthy. So I think those are, again, the three elements: the underlying cause, the form to which you're going to, and then the deprivation, which is sort of your
what you're leaving, what you're leaving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, that clarified things for me. So then, looking at the end of that paragraph, it is not possible either for the form to long for it. Oh, for them, it follows that the contrary yearns for its own destruction. It is not, however, it is not possible either for the form to long for itself, since it is not defective, or for its contrary to long for it. But it is the material that does this, as does the, okay. So is the idea then in your, in kind of the diagram that, Peter and David, you were contributing to make, is it that, that the white wants to become tan? No. Okay, you're shaking your head. So then what does he mean by it yearns for its own destruction? Because the form is not possible either for the form to long for itself or for the contrary to long for it, but it is the material that does this. So like, not Socrates, but Socrates' skin. I'm trying to understand that. Let's go to James Cook.
He's saying that the qualifications are not just alternatives to each other, but they come into existence and go out of existence freely. So the white doesn't have to turn necessarily to tan, but it can just simply it has a right to simply not be white, to be anything else, or to be I guess a better example is there's probably better examples that something that is hard would no longer be hard. It could, but you don't have to say that it is soft. It could simply be fluid, or it doesn't have to be a duality. It could be a difference in existence or non-existence, because we're not talking about a being becoming non-being exactly. We're talking about a quality becoming no longer a quality of the that pertains, since it's not essential to the form after all. And that's where he says, not the ugly or the female, not per se, of the thing, but per accidents of the occasion, something of the occasion. So that's all. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, James. David? David S., you're muted. David S., no? Okay, while David figures out his situation with the voice, Peter?
Well, I think that thing that yearns is material, qua material. As material, it doesn't have any form, so you can't really say anything about it. It's only when it has form, when it's actively being something, that you can say anything about it. So when the wood is being a bed, then it's material for a bed. Material, I think, is always with respect to a particular form.
I'm sorry, is Peter talking?
Yeah, Peter's talking, and then we can go to you. Go for it, Peter.
Okay. So I think material is always with respect to a particular form. So in one sense, you can have a pile of wood sitting off in your shop, and it's not really anything. It's just this pile of wood, but it takes on the form of a bed only in a bed, or it takes on the form of a table only in the table. As wood, it's formless in a sense. It's only when you build a table out of it, or a bed, or whatever, a chair. A human body is only a human body, only has the form of being human when it's living. At some point, he's going to say, if you cut off a finger, it has the shape of a finger, but it's no longer a finger because it's not attached to it, it doesn't wiggle around and perform the functions of being a finger, helping you hold your cup or whatever. So it's only when you have that informed thing. So material is the thing that yearns for it. You can't say that the opposites yearn for each other. The white does not yearn for well, number one, the white doesn't yearn for itself because it's already itself, and doesn't yearn for black, it's opposite, because those are destructive of each other. That's that contrary that we're working for. It's material that yearns for one or the other of those colors.
Thank you, Peter. David?
Right. So I'm not sure what the Aristotelian terminology is. But when we talk about white being independent from brown, being independent from blue, they don't have a causal relation to each other. Whereas moving material things around, as Peter was describing, like the colors do not interact with each other. But we see them realized in materials as part of the form. We call that appearance. So the fact that something appears light or appears dark, depending, on the conditions, or appears blue or appears white, the white and the blue have no, the white doesn't long, it doesn't cause, it doesn't become in any way. Even when the white disappears, there's a privation in the thing of the white, but it has nothing to do with its darkness. I mean, white and dark persist as forms independently and in no way interact. But something participates in those, has the attributes of those, depending on, that'll be its form, part of its form, and we think of that as the interrelation of atoms and electrical fields, which give us the light and give us the colors. But without, at the level that he's able to talk about it, everything in a change of its form is the realization of new attributes as though they come into being, because those attributes are clearly independent of their existence in this thing. That's all. I'm getting frustrated. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, no, Aristotle's a whirlwind of, I feel like it's always really simple language that somehow does not become simple at all. Go for it, Peter.
It's like with one thing, it's just like we're not recognizing that some of these things are ideas and some of these things are material and realized. there's a difference, but when does he clarify that?
I'm not sure.
I just
Peter?
wanted to encourage us to read the next paragraph closely because I think there's a lot of good stuff in that one. The one at the top of 46, there's a sense in which material passes away, blah, blah.
Oh, do you want to read it, Peter?
Sure. We'll just, so this is top of page 46, so like 191B 25, maybe something like that. There is a sense in which the material passes away and comes into being, and there is a sense in which it does not. And that in which a thing is, the material does in its own right suffer destruction, for that which is destroyed is in it, namely the deprivation. But as what is by way of potency, it does not in its own right suffer destruction, but is itself necessarily indestructible and ungenerable. For if it were to come into being, there would have to be something underlying it, present all along, out of which it first came to be. But this is the nature itself of which we are speaking. So it would be before it came to be, which is obviously a contradiction. For by material, I mean what first underlies each thing, out of which something comes into being, which is present all along, but not incidentally. And if it were destroyed to arrive at this condition last, and so therefore, and so before being destroyed in its own right, it would have been destroyed as a deprivation. It's getting at the point that it's hard to get this self-caused stuff, but there's the material there has to be this thing which can undergo these changes of contraries and be supportive of all that. And there's a way of, and there's many more than one way of talking about being here. And that if you try and latch on just the one Parmenidean or the Heraclitean meaning of being, then that is not as subtle. That's too gross of a distinction to be understood. You need to get a little more subtlety in your things. Have to be in many ways in order to be able to support this idea. But potency is you can have something. You can be potencies to have versus activity, right? You don't express all your potencies at once.
David? You're muted, David.
Yeah. I want to examine the potency here, because we are so used to the idea that you take a log and you burn it. The wood has ceased to be. It has stopped being. It's no longer a tree. It's no longer a log. It's no longer even wood. But it hasn't gone out of being. So he's right. Underneath it, the material has not in any way ceased to be. Not one atom has ceased being. It's just all in a completely different form. It no longer has the realistic potentiality to be a log because we don't know how to put it back together. So is that the potency? But in a way, it has all the same potencies in terms of other material aspects of the log. It has the same weight. It has the same. I don't know. It's like stirred coffee. The milk is on top, and now it's stirred. Is it still? Does it have the same potentiality? No, it can never go back to the unstirred. Seems a little like we do this so fluidly, saying that something goes in and out of being, knowing at what level it's gone out of being. And we're not worried about the level at which it subsists unless we're a chemist or, an ecologist examining an ecosystem. In normal existence, the wood ceased to be wood. It can never function again as wood. It ceased to ever be part of a potential chair. We're so cool with this.
Dave?
Just wanted to say I really appreciate his subtlety here in teasing out two aspects of material, that which is and that which is not. And if I was to put this into maybe more modern language, the way that the material is a chemical reaction, for example, when the state of matter can change. And the way in which it is not is perhaps the idea that you can neither create nor destroy energy in its overall. So the conservation of energy is how I'm seeing both of these aspects. Matter changes, it goes through reactions, it degrades, and then there is another sense in which it is immutable, and in its potential, it's always existent, and it's ungenerable, as he says. It's very interesting, his analytical mind.
Huh. Thank you, Dave. I did want to get cracking on book 2, chapters 1 through 3 about causes. Where should we start? Okay, it might be good to just start from the beginning. Of the things that are, some are by nature, others through other causes. So I'll stop there. What do people understand about that? Of the things that are, some are by nature, others through other causes. And really, if there are other places in the text that you can direct us, go for it. But yeah, how are we understanding that? And maybe talking about the motion and rest aspect. We can start with David and then go to Peter.
You gave one example already. If you look at nature, I assume he means that you wander out at what is. So accidentally in the cosmos, there's no house because there needs to be a living being that requires shelter that has constructed the thing. You know, I mean, I guess there are caves for bears, but there's no house with a chimney. You know, so some things we've seen that you need a builder to create, to build, to be the cause of a house. And without that, the materials are just materials. You know, so I think he's given us an example there. Certain kinds of causes are necessary for certain kinds of things to happen. Maybe music, for it to happen, you need a musician. It doesn't just happen in nature. You hear sounds, but there may not be music.
So, and before I go to Peter, just to make sure I understand what you're saying, David, it sounds like some things are dependent or are contingent. Their being is contingent on the being of others.
I don't know if nature is another. Yeah, right. Maybe nature is this non-personal entity, but some things are caused by ideas that require an agent with ideas. That brings in new forms.
Okay, thank you, David. Go for it. Go for it, Peter.
So I'm gonna, well, this whole paragraph will, if you want your example, the house building versus something by nature is going to be this whole paragraph. So we'll get to it in a little bit, but of things that are, some are by nature. So what does it mean to be by nature? It says a few more paragraphs down, or a few more lines down, maybe 4 lines down. For each of these things with a nature has in itself a source of motion and rest. So something is by nature if it has an internal principle of motion and rest, i.e. living things are things by nature. Animals by themselves, you know, scurry about and try and preserve themselves. Plants, you know, they have a principle by which they organize themselves and reproduce, and you know, all that kind of stuff. Those are things that are by nature. The example of house building is something from a different cause. All artifacts, anything that a human builds or creator builds, is the principle. A bed just doesn't assemble itself out of nothing, right? Somebody with a plan says, I want to make a bed, and they have an idea and hire some wood, and then they form the wood in the right way, and they nail it together, and now you have a bed. There was no the principle of motion and rest for making that bed came from outside the bed, came from the creator, the woodworker or whatever. So that's a case where the cause is outside of the thing. So some things by nature, basically living things and the universe as a whole. But things like rocks and caves and things like that are not by nature.
How would you say the cave part? Because caves, how would you say the cave part? Because caves form like either from volcanic activity or like fissures in the formation of mountains. or erosion.
The cave itself is not the thing that would have the principle. The
Oh,
principle needs to
because it
be-
needs something else to act upon it.
the context of being nature is where the principle is. A stone,
Okay.
if you knock a stone in half, it's just going to sit there and be two stones, right?
Okay, cool. Thank you, Peter. Allison?
Yeah, it's kind of like along the same lines that I think everything that you look at that has been that exists, it's either just naturally there or somebody or something created it. So you know, you have all the structures that humans have created, but also like a nest is something that the bird created. So the bird is just created from nature, but the nest is created by the bird. So something acted upon something else. So, you know, maybe you have the little tree leaves and bark and, you know, twigs, and they're just lying around being what they are by their nature, but it took the bird to put them all together and make the nest. Or the, you know, the spider, same thing with the web, or, you know, there's a lot of examples like that.
Cool. Thank you, Allison. James?
I think, I think we've already touched on this, that there are things that are artificial have artificial causes. And he's also going to touch on, I think he also believes that some things are self-caused. So he's going to treat that, his belief that there are things that are self-caused, there's self-cause. Thank you.
Joseph?
Sorry, I'm having a difficulty unmuting. I'm on a phone, so it's a little bit more challenging than usual. When I read the idea, when he talks about nature, I think he's talking about the potential of something and the actuality of something. And so, for example, a plant, you know, can be the actual thing, and then the potential of something in nature to actually become something. And that's what I see with when I'm reading about that things are, you know, by nature are animals and their parts, the plants and the simple bodies such as the earth, fire, and water. You know, that's what I'm thinking, and like things that just become out of nature themselves. So
Yeah,
is
yeah,
that
yeah.
clear? I mean,
Yeah. No,
I mean,
we could hear
I'm
you.
trying. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
No. We definitely got you. Dave.
I was just going to add to your example about the cave. It wouldn't be that the cave has no innate impulse of change. It would be rather the drip of water that wears it away, or the fire of the volcanic eruption that forms the cave, such that nature is necessary to stimulate the change in the cave. The cave in and of itself, outside of any nature surrounding it, even though that's impossible, would just remain as it is.
Thank you, Dave. Nick? Nick?
Yeah, just need a little clarification on the stones and rocks and caves, because earth, air, and fire are of nature. Did Peter or somebody just say that stones or caves are not of nature? Because to me that they are examples of earth, if you will, those things. Just wanted to clarify that.
I think Peter put that in the chat. Peter, do you want to address the next
Did
part?
you say something? Because I can't hear you.
Can everyone else hear me? Dave, Nick, I think it's just you. Peter, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to finish that sentence because it really gives the definite, or at least examples, or somewhat an example of the definition of what nature is. I'll just read the whole sentence. First sentence there. Of the things that are, some are by nature, others through other causes. By nature are animals and their parts, plants, and the simple bodies, such as earth, air, fire, and water. For these things are such things as we say to be by nature, and all of them obviously different from the things not put together by nature. For each of these has in itself a source of motion and rest, either in place or by growth and shrinkage or by alteration. But a bed or a cloak or any other such kind of thing, there is in the respect in which it has happened upon each designation, to the extent that it is from art, has no impulse or change. So artifacts, beds, shaves, they didn't construct themselves. They didn't come to be from themselves. They don't have a nature. Earth, air, and fire, that gets a little bit more tricky because earth, I mean, the motion that is principle with earth is earth goes down, fire goes up. These are the natures of earth and fire. But from those by themselves, you need the concept, what is down and up? That can only be in the entire context of the totality of nature, right? Because at least for the Greeks, the earth is the center at the bottom, stuff comes down, the lunar, up above, the heavenly motions are to circle around and all that kind of stuff. So, so nature as a whole has all these principles of motion, but it's hard to say that a particular rock is by nature. Its nature, its material, it falls down, but beyond that, there's really not much nature to a rock, I guess.
Go for it, Dave.
And the sentence immediately subsequent to what Peter just read, I think teases out what Nick is saying. And Aristotle says, but in this respect in which they happen to be of stone or earth or a mixture, they do have such an impulse to a certain extent. So and again, this is probably what makes Aristotle so challenging, this idea of is and is not. There's always these different levels, I'm gathering, that you can say certain things are and are not at the same time, and that is not contradictory for Aristotle. So there, he does put a little bit of a finer point on it right after Nick, if you wanted to read that.
Yeah, I had trouble parsing that as well. Because if you read forward, they do have an impulse, and to that extent, since nature is a certain source and cause of being moved and of coming to rest, in that to which it belongs primarily in virtue of itself, and not incidentally. So is he saying that they have nature there, stones or earth, or mixtures of self, since they do have such an impulse? They are of nature, or is it the other way?
I would just briefly say, to the extent that they have this impulse, then they would be of nature. And to the extent that it's lacking, we would say the opposite.
Their impulses are certainly simpler than living impulses.
James?
Yeah, I wanted to mention the confusion that the language causes because of this miscategorization of fire as a simple substance, as opposed to a combination of air and a type of probably what he would call earth or substances, which are flammable, which are a subset of perhaps what he refers to as earth. And that confusion, which came out of the Eleatic school or whatever, that that the turbulence of fire was somehow different from the turbulence that we see in the river, in water. It's not different at all. It's the fact that it moves upward is because of an increase in heat. Nothing to do with having an opposition to gravity, which is the downwardness of Earth, so to speak. So, yeah. So I just, I mean, we have to admit that we're dealing with a kind of very elemental, very, very primitive type of science. And a lot of the confusion in reading the text may come, from the level of science that was experienced in Aristotle's time.
David?
That's an interesting point. But there would be a natural tendency to look at fire as different, because when something involved in a fire, unlike in a turbulent water, it's destroyed. So fire is, Aristotle is looking at fire as a thing, whereas fire is actually a process, and it appears a certain way. So it's really a confusion here. But it may not make a problem with his physics and assertions, because I think, as Dave pointed out, he says is, and it means many different things. At one point, we'll say a rock is nature. Another time, or a cave is being rock is nature. And that totally explains one aspect of what we're looking at. But we look at it as, well, it's water had a nature of, softening this limestone, and the water had a tendency to go down and seep away and drag some limestone would create this hole. Nope.
We lost him.
The
David?
nature
Oh, there you go.
caused. Yeah. So did you miss that? I'm sorry.
We missed the last little bit.
Oh, okay. So I'm just saying, there's not one way that Aristotle will assert something is. You'll see it. It is because it is. The rock is nature. It is. But the rock has edges because its nature was to fall and fragment. So it is the shape because of its nature, but that caused this. I was describing how the cave is formed by the nature of the materials, so it was caused, but it's also nature. So you can have the same thing exist and explain it through each of the explanations by stating this was the cause. Well, the cause of the form was the man who hewed the rock, or the cause for the shape was the rock that hit it broke it. All of these are complete descriptions of why it is, and there are different answers to different questions, but they're all put in this singular term of it is and it was caused, and so it's kind of confusing to us. It seems jumbled to me a little bit. The cave is there. It's a hole in the wall. It's not a cave until something goes into it. Now, bear's living it. Now it is a cave. That the bear caused it to be a cave. Before it was just a hole in a mountain. When is it a cave? So that conceptualization of it, now it's participating in a concept. We can say in the Kantian sense, I'm attaching this concept to what is appearing to me. That's kind of my job. I did that. Sorry to resort to Kant.
No. But that's kind of what I was bringing up with Peter earlier about the language part. And that's kind of why I wanted to take us next as well. It does seem that the nature seems to be dependent on not just something else, but for incidental things, but also on someone seeing it. And Aristotle uses a very Heideggerian word on the next page that I want to get to. Maybe I'll just get to that now since someone else raised their hand.
You're right. His seeing something as being, as is a lot about what it's conceived of as that moment that you're thinking it.
Yeah, so on the very next page at the bottom of 50, he says, so in another part, he says the material and the form are nature. That is, I think he says it's the thinghood of nature or something along those lines. But the last paragraph, he says, nature is spoken of thus, as the first material underlying each of the things that have in themselves a source of motion and shape, but in another way as the form, or the look that is disclosed in speech. And skipping away on to the next page. And this form or look is nature more than the material is. For each thing is meant when it is fully at work more than when it is potentially. And this look is kind of the thing that I feel like he was talking about in articulation, because he also said it takes on the look that is disclosed in speech, that by means of which we define when we say what flesh or bone is, and not until then is it by nature. So I feel that he was saying there that something that goes by nature only is by nature until we define it as so. Now I'll go to Tyler and Nick.
Yeah, I was gonna mention there's a couple different kinds of causes in play here, and I think one of the important things is that sometimes something is the cause uh, in a way that's dependent on something that it doesn't necessarily have. So he's going to use the example of a doctor, right? But a human being isn't necessarily a doctor. So the cause of someone's health might be a particular human being, but that it's not in virtue of their being the human being, it's in virtue of them having the skill of being a doctor. So something can be the cause of something in virtue of the nature of something else that isn't necessarily in it, but is partially in it. And I think that's what's going on with the elements, right? Things that are composed of the elements in some respect share in the nature of those elements insofar as they're composed of them.
Thank you, Tyler. Nick?
So yeah, so I can't really kind of comment on what you just read because I really am having trouble finding the place of where we are.
Nick, I sent you a copy of the book. Did you not receive it?
Did you email it to me? Because
Yeah, I did. I emailed
email.
it like a minute after you sent that message.
Oh, really? Okay, not showing yet. I wonder if I gave you nwechaco@gmail.com. Have not received it.
We're right above 193B. Do you have the
Yeah, even with it's just because even if I have the on Kindle, it's very hard to find. Page numbers. The 193s are embedded in the text. Don't know that anybody has had the same problem. But anyway, I raised my hand from the earlier point because I just wanted to also underline that the definition was not just emotion, but also rest. Nature has to rest. And that part is also unclear to me. In all the examples given, it seems like motion was underscored, the fire, it's moving up, earth moving down. What is that resting? That's part of the nature as well. That has to be an essence of whatever the thing is. And what are the things that are of rest, I guess, was going to be my question, which is related to your previous point, not your current reading, Garth. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so could you just restate the last part because I was trying to answer a message about the rest. Could you just say the last point you said, Nick?
Well, I just wanted to find out where are the examples where rest is part of the essence of nature, because there's motion, that part is clear, but then there's also, it's motion and rest. It's not just motion. So I maybe a clarification on what Aristotle meant. I think Peter is kind of nodding his head, so probably.
Nick, I just think of the idea is things tend to fall until they come to rest. Things tend to roll until they stop. So that's the nature of physical bodies, unless they're celestial.
Yeah, Peter, did you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I was going to actually comment about your comment, but I also agree with David that they didn't have the Newton's laws of motion is things will continue in motion unless it's acted upon, right? There's inertia, and they didn't have that thing. It's obvious. You roll a ball, it stops. You roll a stone, it stops eventually. So it started motion because I threw it, and it came to a stop of its own accord, right? In a sense. So it doesn't have that Newtonian idea of inertia or continuing on its trajectory until it's affected by some other force, right? But if you're going to get onto what Garth's question is about that,
The look.
Yeah, the look. So what I mean, I wanted to sort of go back to the second paragraph. Well, first full paragraph on page 50. That'd be 193A. A10, I guess. Now, to some, it seems that nature or the thinghood of things by nature is the first thing present in each which is unarranged, i.e. the nature of a bed is the wood. The nature of a statue is the bronze. So that's in one way in which materialist or the being of something is. It's being of a you certainly have to take account of the fact that a statue is made of bronze and a bed is made of wood or whatever. So that's that first thing. So when you get down to your place that Garth was quoting from, just above 193b, just before that, and in one way, then nature is spoken of thus as the first material underlying each thing. That's one way to talk about it. We have to account for the bronze and the wood, etc. Each of the things that have in themselves a source of motion and change, but in another way, as the form or the look that is disclosed in speech. For just as art is said of what is according to art, so also nature is said of what is according to nature and natural. So when we say that something's natural, we have to say that because it's moving or resting based on its own principles and not from something on the external. The material doesn't bring that with it. The material, at best, if you have earthy material, it'll fall down. But the way that a living being changes is not in an earthy way. It doesn't just fall down. They climb trees and run around, and jump, and do all sorts of things. That kind of motion doesn't come from the underlying material. It comes from the form of the living thing. And that's why he says form is even more of its being or its nature than the material, because the form is the thing that brings the life, in a sense, or explains the life or the motion.
Okay, Greg?
Yeah, and in the Greek for that sentence, it uses morphe for look and eidos for form. It's like eidos has all that Platonic baggage, but morphe does just seem to be the shape of something. But I don't know why the literal shape would be significant, but that just seems really like a mundane word, morphe and eidos in the same sentence.
Thank you, Greg. James?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to point out that, in terms of like Newton's laws, this is not really contradictory because Newton himself says, there's no contradiction here because Newton himself says this, the law of momentum applies to things that are not otherwise interfered with. So the law is not really contradicting the idea of motion ending. Obviously, motion ending has as much cause as things staying in motion. So I just wanted to sort of add that. That's more, there's no conflict between the Aristotelian concept of motion and rest and Newton.
Thank you, James. Peter, I didn't hear you talk about the defining part at all. So I'm still a little bit vague about where articulation is coming in here, because to define something, when we say what flesh and bone is, and not until then is it by nature. So it still seems to say that like something can be by nature, but it's only by nature when we define it.
Well, I don't think he's going to say that it's only when we define it as a by nature. Something's going to be on its nature on its own accord.
But that's exactly what it says.
I'm trying to find that.
Until then,
line.
is it by and not until then is it by nature. The top of 51.
So okay, for what is potentially, so starting at the bottom of 150, right? That for what is potentially flesh or bone, i.e., food I haven't eaten yet.
Yeah.
Like plants or something, my lettuce, my salad, right? Does not yet have its own nature until it takes on the look that is disclosed in speech. Only when we consume our food, it does take on the nature of being Peter rather than food, right?
I don't know.
We comprehend that we comprehend things in language is one thing, but
how do you equate the defining part then? Because I think what you're describing seems to be more like interacting with it. It seems like he's talking specifically about speech and definition.
Well, the weird thing is that if you get towards that thing, he says, so in this other way, nature would be the things having in themselves a source of motion, the form or look, which is not separate other than in speech. That was one of those things he says that like in speech and in our minds, we can separate, we can talk about the form and the matter separately, but you can never have those. So we can have an account of them separately, but you never have something, a material, a physical thing that doesn't have both material and form. I mean, I can't take the material, the form out of the wood and just have pure wood, as it were, just lying there. It will have some form or other.
Why did he use that turn of phrase then? The look that is disclosed in speech. Like that's such a strange.
I don't know. I guess I don't have anything to say on that one.
Yeah, it's such a strange inclusion there.
Maybe-
Go for it.
Maybe he means like in thought, because like we'd say things have to be in time and space.
Charles? Unmute first, Charles.
The translation I have here reads like this: what is potentially flesh or bone has not yet its own nature and does not exist by nature until it receives the form specified in the definition, which we name in defining what flesh and bone is. And so the definition results in the combination of the matter and the form. And the matter and the form here would be what makes a human being be a human being.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and the active part, the motion part, that gives a human being a sense of self-motion, the active part, and the material or the matter, or what constitute a human being, and then we have a definition of it. And then he says, in this sense of nature, this is the second sense of nature, that it would be the shape or the form, not separable, as Peter was talking about, except in statement, except when you're talking about it. It's not, matter and form is never separable. They're never found by themselves apart. It would be the shape and the form of things which have in themselves a source of motion. So once the matter and the form has realized into something we define as a plant or a tree or a human being, then we have a second sense of nature, that this particular thing acts by nature. By nature, plants do this. By nature, human beings do this. And this is a second sense, another way of talking about nature.
Yeah, and I feel, Charles, I was gonna cut you off earlier, but that I feel like your translation points more to what I was saying, that it seems that he's saying that for something to be by nature, in order for that entire process to happen, like there's the form, there's the material, but part of the form of it is coming to a consensus on a definition for it. So that is
right.
Peter, that sounds like a language game. No?
Yeah.
Like you need to come to a consensus on what the thing is when we talk about dog. And then once we come to that consensus in language, then it is by nature. So what is it before that?
Well, before that, mentally, it is part of this whole structure of material or matter and form. What does Sachs call form? What is this terminology?
Or the look. The look.
The look, okay. This whole structure of form and matter, which are material, which constitutes everything. Even the pile of wood that Peter has been talking about is matter and form, because the wood does have a certain way of being. It has a certain way of being this amorphous kind of wood, whether they're in square blocks or round twigs or something of that sort. The artifacts are the things that you would call that are not by nature, but those that are formed that seem to have their own motion. And actually, earth, water, fire, and what's the other one? This air. They have their own motion in a way, and rocks have their own motion in decomposition and that kind of thing. Everything has its own motion in a way, but the real idea of nature is those things that we experience who move on their own and have their own self-motion. I guess generally what we would equate to things that are living and have their own initiative for motion.
David, did you want to say something?
Nope.
No. Oh, okay. Okay. Peter, did you want to take us to the last line?
Oh, I don't know what I can say more about the account versus the thing, but I think it's not correct that only after some humans have made a definition is something by nature. That doesn't strike me as correct, but I don't know exactly how to. I'm missing something. That we have an account, we don't understand. We can't get at nothing is by nature until it's expressing that its form. So form, and only in thought or language or speech can we divorce form from the material. So only in a language game could we talk about the form by itself or the material by itself. We would never ever have that.
But until there is the combination of the matter and form, you can't have a definition.
Greg?
It seems like the
Oh,
form
sorry.
you can have a definition for the essence that form describe would entail, right?
Right. Once they're there, once everything makes the substance or the one thing or the independent thing, then you can define it and you can say what it is. As Garth used the example of the dog a while ago.
And how about this as a sort of rephrasing? A potential doesn't have its own nature until it becomes actual. And so
Yeah.
let's say it's sperm that is potential flesh and bone. It doesn't have the nature of what it is until it becomes flesh and bone, just as it could, become dead cells or whatnot. And so a potential doesn't have its own nature until it comes to be. But there's still such a strong role for language in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah,
thinking about dark matter. We didn't know that dark matter existed until we started theorizing about there being something in nature that we cannot explain for X, Y, and Z. And then they called it dark matter. James? Cook?
Thank you. I think I really did think that Aristotle is being derisive primarily in this paragraph. He's the people blind from birth might reason about colors, even though that's meaningless. Also, people that are tremendously concerned about the names of things have no insight. So, I really appreciate this translation for making that clear. It's the act of anything to make things clear by means of things that are unclear is the act of one who cannot distinguish what is known through itself from what is known not through itself. I mean, it's like kind of like he's basically being derisive about the sort of logic of that kind of abstract logic and speech. And yeah, so I think that's we can't reason from ignorance. We have to reason from facts. That's all.
Thank you, James. David, last comment, it looks like.
Oh, good. Confusion is your last comment. Yes, I was wondering if ideas have potential until does a concept have a potential until it is actually thought. For example, notes can be played time immemorial, tens of thousands of years on a flute made from an animal bone that's hollowed out. 3 notes being sounded at once, creating something that becomes like the major chord, until someone has thought this configuration, heard it. You can hear it and not even think of a major chord, but to actually have a conception of that sound, giving it a name, maybe that's artificial, but even having that clear conception of what that sound is. Was that form, is that a form, first of all, a major chord? And did that form come into being, or is it potentially coming into being until someone actually had the mental concept and could imagine it being realized as a sensible sound? Does the word potential apply to it until it's conceived? And basically, it's like defining a species of dog. The things there in nature occurring without anyone being aware of it, and all of a sudden it's recognized, and now it can be thought of. Logos is entailed here, right? Can anyone clarify? Or am I just putting too many things together?
You're just putting the identity of thought and being together, which I think is okay.
I think musically, you're kind of like pointing at the truth a little bit, that people would tend to sing together, and they would not match tones necessarily. They might create major thirds and perfect fifths by accident, as well as octaves and primes. They would actually, in addition to just being consonant and singing the same notes, they might form the components of chords, recognize the consonants and joy in the major third and the consonants of the fifth, and the components of the major triad would emerge out of attempts to be social with one another through music. That's my musician's explanation for what you're asking.
Well, absolutely. They did build flutes, and they uniformized the sounds, that were produced. But,
well, that happens very late in history, David. That probably happens, the normalization of it happens maybe in the 15th or 16th century, when musical notation emerged. And polyphony. It's the emergence of polyphony in the 15th century primarily.
But if the Chinese built these flutes 7,000 BC and they're making them all the same, they were thinking something common together about how, these sounds. Now, I guess the question isn't when it happened, but is Aristotle saying anything about whether that set of relationships, the Pythagorean relationships, is a form, and whether it was potential always, or is any of this being clarified in this discussion?
I'm a little bit ignorant about that. I don't know if Pythagoras indicated that.
Well, I think that we've only touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to he's mentioned it in passing, potency, and at work. I think those are two big topics that he has not gotten into yet. He's only talked about them in passing, but and being at work, that's the way Sachs puts it, potency and being at work. So I think yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. We will finish up causes for next time and read the next section. We may or may not get into it, but actually causes is pretty short. But yeah, great discussion. Sorry I was late. Try to make it not happen again, but I can't promise to you what my bosses want to talk about after school. So thank you, everyone. And yeah,
Everybody.
if